Matt. Welcome to a new episode of System Update. Tonight, a mountain of new data proves that a significant portion of the population of Gaza is now in immediate risk of dying of mass famine. 1 out of every 6 children in northern Gaza are classified as acute malnutrition and wasting, meaning their bodies have already entered the state of being emaciated. There are now proven reports of children actually dying of starvation and dehydration. And as aid and hunger groups have been warning that this would happen for weeks, there are now all kinds of very strident warnings coming from aid organizations and nurses who have worked in Gaza that they have never seen anything on the scale of a humanitarian disaster this extreme. Now, there's no mystery, nor is there any reasonable debate about why this is happening. Israel's defense minister, Yoav Gallant, vowed in the first week of the war back in October that Israel intended to impose a full blockade on Gaza that would, in his words, mean, quote, no food, no water, no fuel, no electricity. While there has been a minimal amount of humanitarian aid let into Gaza after that, it is nowhere near close to giving the population of 2.2 million people any chance to survive. Israelis have been physically blocking the entrance of aid convoys for weeks. A scene of extreme desperation unfolded before the world's eyes earlier today as hungry and desperate Gazans swarmed aid trucks carrying food and other humanitarian necessities. Moments later, dozens were dead and hundreds seriously injured. While there are conflicting accounts about how many of them actually died and how they died, either through a stampede or by opening fire from the Israeli Defense Forces, some facts are agreed to by both sides, as the New York Times summarized. Quote, Israeli forces opened fire while a crowd was gathered on Thursday near a convoy of trucks carrying desperately needed aid to Gaza City, part of a chaotic scene in which scores of people were killed and injured, according to Gazan health officials and the Israeli military. Whatever your views are on Israel or on the wisdom of Biden's policy of supporting and arming the Israelis without conditions, we are witnessing mass famine of the kind that is rarely seen in the modern world. That is just a fact. On top of that, Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin testified in Congress today, where he said that 25,000 Gazan women and children have been killed by Israel since October 7th. That's 25,000 women and children killed in Gaza. Now, even if you want to assume that every adult male who was killed was a Hamas operative, and that's obviously an absurd assumption, that would still mean that roughly 80% of those Palestinians killed in Gaza by airstrikes and the Israeli ground invasion since October 7th, 80% of those killed are innocent civilians. Roughly 70% of the civilian infrastructure in Gaza is permanently destroyed. And for those who believe it is important to note such things, Israel's claim is that the indiscriminate and widespread famine and killing, now heading into its 6th full month, not between two militaries, but between one military that's among the most sophisticated in the world, backed by the world's largest and most powerful superpower in world history, the United States, against a basically defenseless population composed almost overwhelmingly of women and children. Israel's argument is that it is all justified by the October 7th attack in which Hamas militants killed several hundred Israeli civilians, and that is the number that they killed, several hundred. Meanwhile, the Biden administration remains absolutely steadfast in its support for Israel, repeatedly isolating our country on the world stage in order to block resolutions at the UN, resolutions that are supported by most countries on the planet that call for a ceasefire. Biden, who has spent his career as one of Washington's most unyielding and vocal supporters of Israel, has vowed that the U.S. will continue to fund and arm Israel's military and its war without conditions until the very end. Biden remains adamant in his view, even though, by all accounts, his own re-election in 2024 is threatened by growing anger over this policy among key Democratic voting blocs. On Tuesday, a campaign led by Arab, Muslim, and young voters in Michigan succeeded beyond anyone's wildest dreams. More than 100,000 Democratic Party voters went to the polls to vote uncommitted rather than for Joe Biden as a signal of their willingness to abstain in November over Biden's support for this Israeli war. As all of this unfolds, the true extent of the war propaganda that sustains American support for this war is finally being revealed. Some of the most horrific stories that circulated in the weeks and months even, about what happened in Israel on October 7th. Things like 40 Israeli babies being beheaded, babies murdered by being baked in ovens, obviously recalling the Holocaust. Babies cut out of their pregnant mothers' wombs have been affirmatively debunked. Those things did not happen. They've been proven as lies. As so often happens when we are fed stories designed to view the newest enemy as subhuman savages whose deaths we should not mourn but rather celebrate. The New York Times in particular faces a real and serious journalistic scandal surrounding its highly influential December 28th article that purported to confirm the use of mass rape by Hamas on October 7th. Wars are so horrific and the attack on core humanity so severe that governments know that the only way their populations will tolerate them for as long as those governments want is if people become convinced that the targets of the war are people who deserve suffering, largely because they are something less than human. They're subhuman or savages or so singularly primitive that not only they, but their children and culture and population deserves to be destroyed. And all war propaganda at its core is designed to provoke that belief in us, and a lot of that propaganda typically ends up being debunked as the war proceeds, and that is most definitely the case for a lot of the propaganda surrounding October 7th. Immediately after October 7th, and I give the Israeli government and Israeli officials credit for this, Benjamin Netanyahu and his government made extremely unambiguously and undeniably clear exactly what Israel intended to do in response to October 7th. In fact, they went out of their way to make clear that this was not going to be some limited military operation. They were not going in order to weaken Hamas for a couple of weeks. They were going in, they said, to not only destroy Hamas, but to extract a price on the Palestinians in Gaza unlike anything we have ever seen before. And if you look at the composition of the Israeli government and the way in which it has become far more extremist in terms of its views to the Palestinians over the past 5 years, anybody who wanted to see it understood exactly what the Israelis intended to do, which is to kill an enormous amount of people in Gaza. Given the composition of Gaza, that it's a tiny little densely packed strip of 2.2 million human beings, over half of whom are children, it was very predictable and very clear that an enormous amount of human suffering and human death that would engulf all sorts of not just civilian life, but civilian infrastructure was about to ensue, and that it would create all kinds of humanitarian crises for a population that for 2 decades has been prevented from leaving by Israel, which bombed the only airstrip, the only runway in Gaza, the only airport, and said if you try and rebuild it, we'll bomb it again so nobody can leave by air. They know that if they try and leave by sea, the Israelis will shoot them and kill them, as has happened many times. And all the borders in Gaza are closed by Israel as well as by the military dictator that the United States helped install in Egypt and continues to support and fund. And so you have 2.2 million people who have been trapped inside a tiny little strip of land for 2 decades, and their life is controlled by a foreign military, which determines what can go into Gaza, what can go out. The Israelis have over the years talked about putting them on a diet, meaning that anytime they want to punish them, they reduce the amount of food that can enter Gaza. The Israelis control the airspace, the Israelis control their sea lanes, and the Israelis basically force them to live in an open-air prison. And so when you have a population living under those conditions for 20 years, and then you have a government that makes very clear that they are about to go in and just with their massive air force and with the U.S. government standing fully behind it, arming them, financing them, funding them with no limits, the American taxpayer paying for everything, the Pentagon handing them the bombs in real time as they use them, everyone who wanted to see it knew that what was about to ensue was a catastrophe of immense proportion. And I was definitely one of the people who understood that. I objected from the very start, knowing that what was about to come was unfathomable. And yet I have to say that the extent of the disregard of humanity and the extent of the suffering on the part of innocent people is much, much greater than even I, in that time, knowing all the things I just laid out, I was barely hardly alone. A lot of people knew it too. Didn't take prescience. It just took having your eyes open. It is much worse than I think a lot of people anticipated. And I know there are people in our audience who prefer that we avoid this topic, that we've covered it enough, that our views on it are clear, but sometimes there are things going on in the world that I just don't feel comfortable ignoring, even if there's some pragmatic benefit to doing so. And that is definitely the case with this. We've tried our hardest to cover a lot of other issues over the last 5 months of importance, and I think we've done a good job of doing that. Not spending every night on this war, but when you have a war that is now bringing a massive population to the brink of famine, and we're already watching children die of hunger, the worst way for a human being to die. I mean, we just watched somebody self-immolate in protest of this war, and obviously that is an extremely painful way to die, but at least it's quick. People who die of hunger and malnutrition and dehydration die over days and weeks as their body just shuts down as it starts consuming itself. And on top of that, there's no medication in Gaza. People are still being bombed. They get operated on without anesthesia. And so you're talking here about a level of suffering that is genuinely unfathomable. You have war-weary nurses and doctors and people with aid organizations who have been to almost every war zone and conflict in the world who have said that they have never seen suffering on the level of what they're seeing in Gaza. It's just the truth. And if you want to justify it, if you want to still support it, that's your right to do so. I said many times I have people in my life who do. I understand the impulses that lead people to do so, but at least confront the reality of what's happening. Now, one of the reasons why a lot of focus is on Gaza today, more so than usual, is because an absolutely horrific scene unfolded where some convoys of humanitarian aid, food and medicine and other items that Gazans need for survival were entering Gaza, in northern Gaza. And just imagine if you have children or parents or elderly people or young children near you who are wasting away from starvation, and then you see a truck filled with food, imagine what you would do. And so a very intense scene of very desperate people broke out, and within a short period of time, dozens, if not more of them, were dead. And the Gazans claim that they were all killed or mostly killed because the Israeli military opened fire and shot them. The Israeli military claims that most of them were killed because they were trampled on because of the crush of the people trying to get to these trucks and the fights that broke out and the stampede that ensued. But the Israeli military admits that they also shot at several of the people or many of the people there. They claim that they only shot at them when they began approaching because the Israeli military felt fearful and so started shooting at their kneecaps. But the Israelis admit that at least some of them died through Israelis opening fire. I don't really know how a highly sophisticated military occupying a land with tanks and all kinds of weaponry and intelligence and tech can feel sufficiently frightened by an unarmed group of people to just open fire on them when they're desperately trying to get food. But that's what the Israeli claim is. Here's from the New York Times today. As hungry Gazans crowd a convoy, a crush of bodies, Israeli gunshots, and a deadly toll. Quote, Israeli forces opened fire while a crowd was gathered on Thursday near a convoy of trucks carrying desperately needed aid to Gaza City. Part of a chaotic scene in which scores of people were killed and injured, according to Gazan health officials and the Israeli military. The details of what happened were unclear, with officials from both sides offering starkly different accounts. The Gazan Health Ministry said in a statement that more than 100 people were killed and more than 700 injured in a, quote, massacre. Israeli military officials said most of the casualties were from a stampede of Gazans as they crushed around the aid trucks, and that soldiers had fired only after a crowd separately approached them in a threatening way. Israeli military spokesman Rear Admiral Daniel Hagari said in a televised briefing that the soldiers opened fire, quote, only in face of danger when the mob moved in a manner which endangered them. Now, let us remember that from the start of the war, the Israelis have vowed at the highest levels of the government that they would cut off food and water on purpose to the Gazans. Not that they wouldn't provide it, but that they would blockade anyone else from trying to send aid in. And that is something that they have absolutely done. Now, here is a account of what happened, which is from Axios, that just gives a little more detail. Dozens of Palestinians killed in an incident around Gaza aid convoy. An IDF official told reporters that shortly after the trucks crossed the Israeli military checkpoint on the way to Gaza City, thousands of Palestinian civilians arrived in the area and many began looting the trucks. The IDF released a drone video showing Palestinians crowding around and looting the trucks. The IDF official said Israeli forces fired on dozens of Palestinian civilians who approached the IDF and got within tens of meters. According to the official, the soldiers felt threatened and initially fired warning shots. They then fired at the legs of the Palestinians, who continued their approach, the official claimed, adding that most casualties were the result of the stampede or truck drivers running over people. Here is the drone footage released by the IDF. It's a silent video, but you can see just the desperate crowd gathering at these convoys. What did you do? So you're seeing here a drone footage with a huge number of people, and they're gathered wherever the trucks are. They're gathered in numbers. You can see them kind of scampering and running around in a very misdirected and chaotic way. These are obviously desperate people who have been cut off from food for a long time, cut off from sustenance for a long time. And I think the IDF believes that this is designed to show that somehow, though you can't see anybody being trampled or stampeded, that it's the kind of an environment that might lead to that. You see people running, desperately trying to get food off the truck. And there are definitely a lot of people here. There are a lot of people gathered in a very densely packed way. You can see in a closer footage here, there are those trucks, the convoys of the trucks, and there are people running up to them, trying to grab things off of them. This is what desperate, starving people do, who have been victimized by a siege for now almost 6 months. These are people who survived bombing, who watch people die all around them, who are internally displaced. They're jumping on the trucks. They're trying to take things off the trucks. Behavior that I at least think is extremely understandable if you're somebody who is in Gaza and surrounded by the kind of famine and death that has surrounded them. Now, here is the Israeli Interior Minister, Ben-Gvir, who is considered one of the more extremist people in the Israeli government. And at first, the Israeli government was trying to deny that any of the people who died were killed because the Israelis opened fire on them. And yet, this is the National Security Minister, Itamar Ben-Gvir, who came out in a tweet and seemed to contradict that denial by celebrating the fact that the Israeli military did what they should have done, which is opening fire on the Gazans. Here's what he tweeted, quote, he tweeted this in Hebrew, and this is the English translation, quote, "Total support must be given to our heroic fighters operating in Gaza, who acted excellently against a Gazan mob that tried to harm them. Today it was proven that the transfer of humanitarian aid to Gaza is not only madness, while our abductees are being held in the strip under substandard conditions, but also endangers the IDF soldiers. This is another clear reason why we must stop transferring this aid, which is in fact aid to harm the IDF soldiers and oxygen to Hamas." So you hear people inside the Israeli government, at the highest levels of the Israeli government, explicitly saying it's a mistake to let any aid in. We shouldn't be allowing any aid in at all. Now, one of the bizarre parts of this has always been that people continue to justify everything the Israelis are doing by pointing to the hostages that were taken. Over 100 hostages still remain, between the ones who were returned, the ones who have died in Israeli bombardment. And it seems like a very odd framework to say, what we're doing everything to try and save the hostages, when you're mass bombing, indiscriminately bombing exactly the places where you know the hostages are. Obviously, you're going to kill a lot of the hostages you're claiming you're trying to rescue. And a lot of the hostages who have been released said that they ate very poorly, but that they ate exactly the same thing as their captors were eating. Their captors were sharing the same food with them and giving them the same portions. Because obviously, if you blockade an area and prevent food from coming in and you starve the population to death, that's going to also end up starving the hostages that you claim you're trying to save. So it's always been a very bizarre rationale to say we're bombing massively and we're starving this area where our hostages are because we want to save our hostages. It seems far more likely that you're going to end up killing them. Now, people will automatically dismiss, a lot of people will, whatever the Palestinian Health Authority says in Gaza by claiming, oh, well, that's controlled by Hamas, even though they have a record of providing very accurate data about how many people have been killed in previous Israeli campaigns. And then, of course, if there's any journalists inside Gaza, they'll dismiss that and say, well, these are Hamas spokespeople. So then what are you left with in terms of trying to understand what's happening in Gaza? Well, there are aid groups, aid organizations that go around the world risking their lives in war zones to try and provide humanitarian assistance to a certain population. And those rights groups have been very clear that the only reason why people in Gaza are deprived of aid and deprived of food is because the Israelis refuse to let any in, that they're deliberately starving the Palestinians. Here from The Guardian this week, Israel is deliberately starving Palestinians, UN rights expert says. UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food, Michael Fakhri, said denial of food is a war crime and constitutes, quote, a situation of genocide. Quote, nutrition screenings at health centers and shelters in January found almost 16% of children under the age of 2, the equivalent of 1 in 6 infants, were acutely malnourished or wasting in northern Gaza, where 300,000 people are trapped with virtually no food and being allowed in by Israel. Of these, almost 3% are suffering from severe wasting, at high risk of medical complications or death without urgent help, according to a recent UN report. Reports have emerged of parents feeding their children animal feed in hope of keeping them alive. In Rafah in the south, where Israel is currently focusing military attacks, 5% of children under 2 years were acutely malnourished. Internationally starving civilians by, quote, depriving them of objects indispensable to their survival, including willfully impeding relief supplies, is a war crime, according to the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. Indispensable objects include food, water, and shelter, which Israel is systematically denying Palestinians. Starvation is a war crime under the Geneva Conventions and the Rome Statute. Now, for those of you who think to yourself, well, this is not really my business, this is not really my war, remember that this war is as much of an American war as it is an Israeli war. That's how the world perceives it, for good reason, because it's factually true that the U.S. is paying for this war, the U.S. is financing this war, the U.S. is providing Israel with the weapons and the arms that it's using to carry all of this out. The U.S. is isolating itself on the world stage by vetoing any attempts to call for a ceasefire. So in every sense of the world, this is an American war. If you are an American citizen, you're paying for this war. Your government is incurring all kinds of costs to enable it. This is not just a war on the other side of the world. This is an American war, every bit as much as the war in Ukraine is. Here from the AP today, a quarter of Gaza's population is one step from famine and aid trucks are looted, UN says. At least 1/4 of Gaza's population, 576,000 people, are one step away from famine, and virtually the entire population desperately needs food, resulting in some aid trucks being shot at, looted, and overwhelmed by hungry people, top UN officials said Tuesday. The officials from the UN Humanitarian Office and the UN's food and agricultural organizations painted a dire picture for all 2.3 million people in Gaza, facing crisis levels of food insecurity or worse, and civil order breaking down, especially in the north where food and other humanitarian supplies are scarce. And as grim as the picture is today, UN Humanitarian Coordinator Ramesh Ramaskan told the UN Security Council that there is every possibility for further deterioration, Carl Scow, Deputy Executive Director of the World Food Program, said that this is, quote, the worst level of child malnutrition anywhere in the world. And he warned that, quote, if nothing changes, a famine is imminent in northern Gaza. Israel's Deputy UN Ambassador Brett Miller told the Council that while fighting Hamas, it is doing, quote, all it can to care for civilians and is working constantly to ensure the entry of humanitarian aid from numerous countries and U.S. aid agencies. CNN has been a very vocal supporter of the Israeli government and the Israeli war from the start. You had anchors on CNN like Jake Tapper and Dana Bash that have spoken of their personal connection to Israel. Dana Bash said a prayer for Israel on one of the CNN shows on October 8th or October 9th, a Jewish prayer for Israel. Their coverage has been almost uniformly positive in terms of the Israeli perspective. Yesterday, though, they had on to their program, and this was, I believe, a version of international CNN that's hosted by Isa Soares. And here is an Irish nurse, I believe she's Irish, who works with one of these aid organizations. And I just want you to listen to what she said, having been to Gaza, having all kinds of colleagues in Gaza that she's worked with, a long time, healthcare workers and others, about the situation in Gaza. Here's what she has to say.
Just explain first to our viewers why aid isn't being allowed in. Where is the aid?
It's very simple. It's because the Israeli military won't let it in. We could end this starvation tomorrow very simply if they would just let us have access to people there, but it's not being allowed. This is what they said on the 7th of October. Nothing will go in, and so it remains the case. And for people in the north of Gaza, it's even worse because no food is reaching them anymore. And so my own staff, my own colleague Abir, has been eating animal feed. And horrifyingly, the food that they were eating, which is food for horse and donkeys, is now running out, and now they're eating birdseed. The statistics also tell their own story. 1 in 6 children under the age of 2 in the north of Gaza are now acutely malnourished. This is the fastest decline in a population's nutrition status ever recorded, and what that means is that children are being starved at the fastest rate the world has ever seen. And we could finish it tomorrow. We could save them all, but we're not being able to.
I mean, I presume you heard in process what she said. She said that children are being starved at the fastest rate we have ever seen. And unless you want to just dismiss every single healthcare worker, every dedicated aid organization as somehow propagandistic against Israel, all willing to lie collectively for some reason, I know it's kind of a human impulse to believe that human suffering and humanitarian catastrophe on this scale probably isn't happening. It's a comforting belief to convince ourselves or lure ourselves into accepting. The evidence is just overwhelming. It's overwhelming. If you just listen to any of the people who have been to Gaza, who have colleagues there, everything they're describing is very uniform. The data proves it. Neutral aid organizations are all saying the same thing, that this is a catastrophe on a scale unlike anything they've ever seen. Here is a different video from earlier this week of other aid when it appears, watch what happens, how desperate the people in Gaza are as they try and just get some of it for their family. This is why social order is breaking down. Thousands of hungry Palestinians scrambled to retrieve aid packages. Airdrop by the Jordanian army. So they're dropping them in sea. People went out to sea to collect them. But it wasn't clear if all could be saved. And you see people walking around in massive numbers. Rights groups say that what little aid was reaching Gaza has decreased dramatically. Israeli forces are accused of targeting trucks and firing on civilians, as well as severely restricting the amount of aid getting in by road. Last week, the World Food Program suspended aid to northern Gaza due to, quote, complete chaos and violence. The UN says at least 500,000 people are facing famine in Gaza. Red Cross officials say airdropping aid is seen as, quote, a last resort. And you see some video there of food being airdropped. Now, the United States actually leaked reports from the Biden White House today saying that the United States was considering airdropping humanitarian aid in Gaza because not even the United States can get aid into Gaza because Israel won't allow it. So here we are paying for Israel's war. We're financing Israel's war. They're a patron state of ours. We give them $4 billion every year, and then every time they have a war, they get billions more. They ask for billions more. We transfer arms to them on a level, whatever they ask for. And yet, the position of the Biden administration is that we have no leverage over Israel, that they're a sovereign state, they do what they want, even though we're the ones on whom they're relying to fight this war. And according to the Biden administration, they won't even let the United States deliver aid to Gaza, which of course the United States wants to do, if for no other reason than to placate voting constituencies on whom Biden will rely this year and if he wants to have any chance of being reelected. It just shows you this bizarre relationship that we finance Israel, we arm Israel, we shield them at the UN, and yet whenever we ask them to do something or whenever we tell them that something that they're doing is contrary to our interests, they do it anyway. And then U.S. officials have to stand before cameras and say, well, look, we have no leverage over the Israelis. Here is Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin testifying in Congress today when he was asked about how many women and children have been killed and other questions by Congressman Ro Khanna of California. Here's what the Secretary said in Congress today.
Mr. Secretary, about how many Palestinian women and children have been killed by Israel since October 7th?
It's over 25,000.
Mr. Secretary, last week, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights warned that any transfer of weapon or ammunition to Israel violates international law. About how many precision-guided munitions has the United States given Israel since the beginning of the war?
I don't have that number at my fingertips, but we have endeavored.
Mr. Secretary, it's about 21,000 precision-guided munitions to Israel since the start of the war. Secretary Austin, last week you spoke to Defense Minister Gallant, and you said clearly there needs to be a plan to ensure the safety and support of those sheltering in Rafah before any military operations proceed. National Security Advisor Sullivan has said he has not seen any plan yet. John Kirby said it would be a disaster to invade Rafah. If Netanyahu defies the United States and invades Rafah, will you commit today that you will halt any future military sales to Israel?
Obviously, sir, that's a presidential decision, but we expect that. And by the way, I spoke to Minister Gallant last night, and I expect that when we provide munitions to allies and partners, that they'll use them in a responsible way.
So, the United States has been pretty clear that one of the lines that the Biden administration is setting, at least rhetorically, is that there's one part of Gaza where the Gazans were told to go, which is the Rafah refugee camp, where at least 1 million of them are there. 95% of the country is internally displaced. And the Israelis were threatening to launch a ground invasion right into that camp. And the horrors for civilians there would be inconceivable. And the United States has said, we don't want you to do that, absent a plan to ensure their safety. And the position of the Netanyahu government is, well, we're going to do it anyway. We think it's in our interest to do it, and we're going to do whatever we think is in our interest, regardless of what you, the United States, want, even though you're paying for a war. And what the Biden administration has been doing is leaking news items about how frustrated Biden is, about how impatient he is with Netanyahu, about how he's had it with Israel. And yet, the United States will not say at any point that Israeli aid to Israel is in any way jeopardized, that even if they do something so extreme like attack Rafah with the ground invasion, when the United States has made clear publicly that the United States government opposes it, they still won't say that Israel could lose the aid and the money and the arms that we're providing them. That's how unserious the United States is about Joe Biden is about doing anything meaningful to oppose Israel. He's willing to take political steps to try and deceive the voters he needs who are angry at him to believe that he's doing something. But Joe Biden has been a true believer for his entire Senate career. We've showed you the videos in the 80s and the 90s and into the 2000s, and then when he was vice president to President Obama, that he has been one of the most vocal and steadfast supporters of Israel in all of Washington for decades, and he still is. Instead of in any way taking any tangible steps to try and limit the number of civilian death and suffering in Gaza, which, remember, the United States is incurring a lot of harm for, since everyone in that region blames the United States for our doing this because they understand it's our war. Here's the type of almost condescending and knowing self-delusion that people like the State Department spokesman Matthew Miller, who used to be, right before Biden was elected, an MSNBC spokesman. This is where these people come from. This is the kind of thing that he has been saying. This is what he said this week at a State Department briefing when pressed by reporters about what the United States would do if Israel continues to defy what the United States pretends is its wishes.
Ready to work with them on how to achieve that vision.
But you have so many tools. Just my last follow-up, sorry. But you have so much leverage over the Israelis. And this is fundamental vision of the president. So you can use all the leverage you want, including weapons that you sell to Israel, to make sure that this plan is at least on the right path for implementation, considering we have short time between now and November.
So one thing I will say about that people often tend to forget is that Israel, like other countries in the region, is a sovereign country that makes its own decisions. The United States does not dictate to Israel what it must do, just as we don't dictate to any country what it must do. We present what we believe are the. We present what we believe are the. Good one, Matt.
That was AP's Matt Lee, as he was saying, we don't tell any country what to do. We don't dictate to any country. And Matt Lee said, unless we're invading them. And it got a little giggle, a little cackle. Look at how kind of entertained Matthew Miller is. Because, of course, the idea that the United States doesn't tell other countries what to do, doesn't use its aid as leverage to get what it wants from other countries, is an insulting joke that nobody with any knowledge beyond sixth grade civic class believes. The reality is that the Biden administration does not want to in any way limit Israel, in part because they support what Israel is doing, and in part because they're afraid of the political ramifications of having Netanyahu say that the United States is trying to limit what they're doing. And ultimately, they fear more the political ramifications of angering or alienating the people in the United States who are fanatical supporters of Israel and who vote for Democratic Party candidates, which is a huge number of them, more than they fear alienating the political left, because they think and believe, with good reason, that the left will snap into line at the end of the day by simply fear-mongering against Trump. But they know that fanatical supporters of Israel will not vote for Democrats if they believe that Democrats are doing anything other than offering unconditional and unlimited American support to Israel. And that's why they're being so careful never to place any real limits on Israel. Now, just to indicate how powerful the pro-Israel sentiment is in the Biden White House, and I know there are a lot of people on the right who have been encouraged to believe that whatever conservatives believe Joe Biden is against, people get convinced he's soft on China, even though he's been militarily encircling China with bases and was the first American president in a decade to explicitly vow that the United States would go to war with China if it meant protecting Taiwan. And one of the things that a lot of conservatives have come to believe is that Joe Biden and Democrats are soft on Israel, even though the Democratic Party is at least as dedicated to the protection and financing of Israel as the Republican Party is. And Joe Biden continues to insist on that, even though that policy is posing a very serious risk to his reelection in 2024. Here's ABC News yesterday analyzing the extraordinary vote in Michigan on Tuesday night, in which over 100,000 people in Michigan went to the polls specifically to vote uncommitted instead of voting for Joe Biden. And the headline here is, could Arab American and Muslim voters cost Biden the 2024 election? They're a small voting bloc, but could make the difference in Michigan. Quote, at least 100,000 Democrats in the Great Lakes state voted for, quote, uncommitted. A protest vote driven in large part by dissatisfaction with Biden's handling of the Israel-Hamas war. Multiple groups had urged voters to reject Biden due to his support for Israel in the conflict, and the, quote, uncommitted vote was particularly high in heavily Arab American and Muslim cities such as Dearborn, where uncommitted actually defeated Biden 56 to 40%. The deep discomfort among these normally Democratic voting blocs could be a problem for Biden in November, particularly in swing state Michigan, which has the highest share of Arab Americans and one of the highest share of Muslims. The Biden campaign is counting on Arab Americans and Muslim voters holding their nose and voting for him anyway when they consider the likely alternative, former President Donald Trump, who also supports Israel and has a history of anti-Muslim rhetoric. In other words, what they're counting on is that there's no difference between the parties on this issue, and that at the end of the day, they will be scared by fear-mongering over Trump. Oh, Trump will do these things to you that Biden would never do. But there are a lot of Muslim and Arab voters, and not just Muslim and Arab voters, but younger voters and leftist voters who are saying that this is a line too far, that Biden's crossing this line will mean that they will never vote for Joe Biden unless there's a radical change in Biden's policy toward Israel, which is virtually impossible to conceive of. But that is the extent to which the Biden White House is willing to embrace this pro-Israel support, knowing that it might even cost them the election. Now, one of the most important parts of journalism when it comes to war is to scrutinize and investigate and debunk propaganda that comes from every side in every war. Propaganda and lies are a part of every war. You might remember at the start of the war in Ukraine, there were all kinds of lies told about things that happened that never happened, about courageous Ukrainian soldiers on an island saying F you Russia and refusing to surrender and being killed when in fact they all surrendered, about some mythical fighter pilot called the Ghost of Kiev who had supposedly shot down single-handedly 50 or 60 different Russian jets, and that was a complete myth as well. Just lies that constantly get turned out. You go to every war, the war in Vietnam, that was provoked by an absolute lie that the U.S. security state now admits it lied about, which they claim was an act of aggression by the North Vietnamese in the Gulf of Tonkin, which was completely fabricated. Obviously, the war in Iraq was provoked by fabricated claims of weapons of mass destruction. In the Gulf War, they had a woman who was paid to come and testify before Congress about how Saddam Hussein was pulling babies out of incubators. And it just shocked everybody about the evil and the savagery of Saddam Hussein. It turned out to be completely untrue. There's almost every war. And there's nothing different about the war in Israel, in Gaza. What was necessary was for Israel not to just accurately describe the atrocities that were committed on October 7th, and there were absolutely atrocities on October 7th. Civilians killed in terrible ways, in brutal ways, people shot indiscriminately. But that wasn't enough. Knowing what the Israelis intended to do in Gaza, they needed the world to believe that this was not just an ordinary attack, that this was done by a kind of evil we had never seen before. Remember, they were describing them as worse than Nazis, worse than ISIS. And all kinds of stories got fabricated. That 40 babies were beheaded on October 7th, that babies were killed by being baked in ovens, that babies were cut out of their mothers' wombs, and most importantly of all, that Hamas used on a mass scale sexual violence and sexual assault. And one of the most important articles that sealed this narrative as being confirmed was a December 28th article in the New York Times by their Pulitzer Prize-winning bureau chief Jeffrey Gettleman, along with two journalists that nobody ever heard of before, Anat Schwartz and Adam Sella. They had very prominent bylines on this article, even though they were not New York Times reporters, had never reported on Israel previously. And the article headline was "Screams Without Words, How Hamas Weaponized Sexual Violence on October 7th. And it read, quote, "A Times investigation uncovered new details showing a pattern of rape, mutilation, and extreme brutality against women in the attacks on Israel. Now, one of the things that happened was that a family that was featured in the New York Times article as having had a close relative who was raped by Hamas on October 7th came out and repudiated the story angrily, objecting to their inclusion in the story. And it was covered only by a handful of small independent outlets that tend to be critical of Israel, one of whom was Mondoweiss, who on January 3rd, 2024, so just 5 days or so after this New York Times article was published, had this article with the headline, "Family of Key Case in New York Times October 7th Sexual Violence Report Renounces the Story, says the reporters manipulated them." Quote, "A New York Times story claiming a pattern of gender-based violence on October 7th hinged on the story of Gal Abdush. But the Abdush family said that there is no proof she was raped and that Times reporters interviewed them under false pretenses. A heartbreaking photo of Gal Abdush's family, a working-class Mizrahi Jewish family who lost their daughter and son-in-law, appeared on the newspaper's cover. The newspaper devoted a third of its story to the Abdush story. On December 29th, the Israeli website Ynet published an interview with Eti Braka, Gal Abdush's mother. In the interview, the mother said that the family knew nothing about the sexual assault issue until the piece in the Times was published. Quote, "We didn't know about the rape at all. We only knew after a New York Times journalist contacted us. They said they matched evidence and concluded that she had been sexually assaulted." Then on January 1st, Nissim Abdush, Nagi's brother, appeared in an interview on Israeli Channel 13. Nissim repeatedly denied that his sister-in-law was raped. Nissim also stated that no official party informed them of these doubts or this investigation. Neither the police nor forensic experts. In the interview, Abdush reiterated that his brother's wife was not raped and that, quote, "the media invented it." Gal's sisters also denied allegations of rape. Now, one of the things that happened when these rape stories began emerging, and there was all kinds of demands that Western feminists who say that they defend women in rape cases have an obligation to come out and denounce Hamas and defend Israeli women. This happened right at the time when hostages were being released from Gaza, and a lot of them are giving interviews saying that they were actually well treated while in captivity. This is not my claim, this is theirs. They were back in Israel safe. Several of them had no people left back in Gaza. And they were saying things like they were well treated, they were never victimized by sexual assault, including women, that their captors shared with them the same food that they ate. And that was becoming a big concern because the only way the Israelis could, and they knew this at the time, justify in people's minds what they were doing and knew they were going to do to Gaza, namely destroy it all, was if they could convince people that the people in Gaza were not really human beings, that they were subhuman. And that's how the Israelis spoke about them from the very beginning. When the defense minister said, "We're going to cut off all food and water," he quickly added, "We're dealing with human animals, and that's how we're going to treat them." And to this day, if you object to what's happening in Gaza, you'll have all kinds of people who want to defend it, insist that, oh, the people in Gaza deserve it because they're savages, they're monsters, they're not really human, and point to a lot of these debunked stories about what was done on October 7th that actually never happened. And again, there were atrocities on October 7th. There's no denying that. But they had to manufacture some of the worst stories because they wanted to put in people's heads that everything we're going to do for the next 8 months or 9 months and the extreme suffering you're about to hear about, including the killing of children, these are not really human beings. These are monsters and mongrels and subhumans. And all of these fabricated stories were necessary to do that, just like war propaganda of this kind always is designed to accomplish. Now, one of the things that happened is that a Twitter user named Z Squirrel, who is an anonymous Twitter user, someone very smart, someone very vigilant, someone who does a lot of that kind of research about that independent journalism is dedicated to doing, even though this person has no resources, works alone. They're the ones who broke a story that the New York Times should have known on their own about the people they were using to report that story. On January 24th, this account wrote the following: "Oh my God, one of the 3 authors of the New York Times mass rape atrocity propaganda hoax is Anat Schwartz. She liked posts that called for Gaza to be turned into a, quote, slaughterhouse. This is the person the New York Times hired to write about Palestinians and frame them as subhuman monsters. By the way, Anat Schwartz never wrote a single word for the New York Times before November. This is her first piece for them. And they chose a person who believes that Gaza, quote, must be turned into a slaughterhouse and that Palestinians are, quote, animals who deserve a Holocaust." The Squirrel then came back this week and said the other on-the-ground reporter who gave Jeffrey Gettleman all the materials for the hoax, which he then gleefully wrote up, is Adam Sella, the nephew of Schwartz's husband, a recent college grad who is an inspiring food writer who also has 0 reporting experience. And there you see his bio, Adam Sella. He was one of 3 reporters on this story. He's obviously a very young person. He describes himself as a freelancer at the New York Times who lives in Tel Aviv. And in the About section, he says he went to Harvard. He says, "I am a writer, researcher, editor, and translator covering Israel, Palestine, and the intersection of food and the environment." He got a BA in comparative literature at Harvard, and he says, "My background is working for various publication and food companies, combined with my hands-on work in kitchen and farms, which makes me well-suited to write about sustainable food." That's who they got, along with this person who, Anat Schwartz, upon further investigation, also served in the IDF, has been liking all kinds of tweets over weeks, calling for mass death in Gaza. And those were the 2 on-the-ground reporters, quote-unquote, that fed Jeffrey Gettleman the story that ultimately came very dubious. And it is a huge crisis for the New York Times to have so much questionable behavior in one of their most important stories covering this war. The Intercept reported, based on sources of the New York Times, that their highly popular and influential podcast, The Daily, had planned on having Jeffrey Gettleman on to talk about this story, and then ultimately decided that it couldn't pass their fact-checking, and that given all the questions, including the denials by the Key family, decided not to feature it on The Daily at all, and to this day it hasn't been. And as a result, there's all kinds of internal scrutiny now in the New York Times as a result of all these things that were found, including by this anonymous Twitter account that the New York Times could easily have found with the same investigative scrutiny. Here's the headline in the Intercept from today. The New York Times puts, quote, "The Daily episode on ice amid internal firestorm over Hamas sexual violence article." Quote, "As the Times faces scrutiny for the coverage of Israel's war on Gaza, it has capitulated to the pro-Israel media watchdog camera. The New York Times pulled a high-profile episode of the podcast The Daily about sexual violence perpetrated by Hamas on October 7th amid a furious internal debate about the strength of the paper's original reporting on the subject. Times news sources told The Intercept, Times newsroom sources. The episode had been scheduled for January 9th, and the critics have highlighted major discrepancies in the account presented in the Times, subsequent public comments from the family of a major subject of the article denouncing it, and comments from a key witness seeming to contradict a claim attributed to him in the article. Now, one thing that should give you a great deal of skepticism about things you've been told are some of the stories that shaped how people understood not just October 7th, but who the people in Gaza are, deliberately. Here from the NBC on October 12th, 5 days after the Hamas attack, unverified reports of, quote, 40 babies beheaded in Israel-Hamas war inflamed social media. Quote, "No photo evidence has been made public as of Thursday morning corroborating claims that babies had been beheaded. Israel has published photos of dead infants after the terrorist attack. The most high-profile claim came Wednesday night when President Joe Biden said that he had seen photographic evidence of terrorists beheading children. And he then walked that back, saying actually he hadn't seen those photos. He had just been told about them by Netanyahu. And then the biggest debunking came by the Israeli newspaper Haaretz, which is a liberal newspaper, but also editorially in favor of the Israeli war in Gaza. And on December 4th, 2023, so almost 2 full months after the attack, they published this article which said Hamas did commit documented atrocities, but a few false stories feed the deniers. So they were framing it as these false stories are damaging because it gives credence to the people who say Israel is lying. But the article was very damning about the extent of the lies on October 7th. This is their subheadline. Remember, this is not a leftist newspaper in America. This is a mainstream newspaper in Israel that supports the Israeli war in Gaza. Quote, the extensive evidence of crimes against humanity committed by Hamas terrorists on October 7th should not be contaminated by unverified stories disseminated by Israeli search and rescue groups, army officers, and even Sarah Netanyahu. Quote, according to a reporter for I-24 News, an army commander told her that at least 40 babies had been killed, some of them beheaded. The report above was later quoted on social media, often references, quote, dozens of beheaded babies, though sometimes it was, quote, burnt babies or hanged babies. For example, the Foreign Ministry of Israel published an account by Colonel Golan Vach from the Home Front Command, who said that in one house he found the bodies of 8 burnt babies. The Twitter account of the Prime Minister's office also referred to the murder of infants and showed very graphic pictures. According to the tweet, President Benjamin Netanyahu showed the pictures to U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken. According to sources including Israel's National Insurance Institute, kibbutz leaders, and the police, on October 7th, 1 baby was murdered, 10-month-old Mila Cohen. She was killed with her father, Ohad, on kibbutz Be'eri. So I just want you to remember what you were told about what happened October 7th. All those stories that circulated, including from the Israeli government, and contrast it to the very comprehensive report from Haaretz that demonstrated that on October 7th, there was a total of 1 baby who was murdered. Other than deliberate lying and an intent to deceive, how is it possible to have concluded that there were 40 beheaded babies when there was a grand total of 1 infant that was killed on October 7th? Only lying and fabrication would cause somebody to claim that. You would see 40 beheaded babies. They had none of those. There were no cutting babies out of wombs. There were no baking babies in ovens. These were all absolute lies spread by the Israeli government and their supporters in the United States. Not because there were no atrocities on October 7th, there were, but because the goal was to convince Americans that people in Palestine are something completely different. They're not human. They're somehow more savage than Nazis. They're worse than ISIS. And all of these lies were vital to sustaining that. And at the end of the day, a lot of these lies were what led a lot of Americans to decide, including people who marched under the banner of America First and staying out of other foreign wars, that Joe Biden is right to finance the Israeli war because these people that are being killed are people who deserve it because they're subhuman. And if you get to the point where you've let people lose your humanity, relinquish your humanity, cheer for some of the most grotesque acts that human beings are capable of imposing on others, including entire populations of women and children, then I would suggest that you need to seriously reconsider what it is that you have been led to support.